Section 14 of Confessions, volumes 5 and 6. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Anonymously translated. Section 14. From these studies I passed to the elements of geometry, for I never went further, forcing my weak memory to retain them by going the same ground 100 and 100 times over. I did not admire Euclid, who rather seeks a chain of demonstration than a connection of ideas. I preferred the geometry of Father Lamy, who from that time became one of my favorite authors, and whose works I yet read with pleasure. Algebra followed, and Father Lamy was still my guide. When I made some progress, I perused Father Reynaud's Science of Calculation, and then his Analysis Demonstrated. But I never went far enough thoroughly to understand the application of algebra to geometry. I was not pleased with this method of performing operations by rule, without knowing what I was about. Resolving geometrical problems by the help of equations seemed like playing a tune by turning round a handle. The first time I found by calculation that the square of a binocular figure was composed of the square of each of its parts, and double the product of one by the other. Though convinced that my multiplication was right, I could not be satisfied till I had made and examined the figure. Not but I admire algebra when applied to abstract quantities, but when used to demonstrate dimensions, I wished to see the operation, and unless explained by lines, could not rightly comprehend it. After this came Latin. It was my most painful study, and in which I never made great progress. I began by Port-Royal's Rudiments, but without success. I lost myself in a crowd of rules, and in studying the last, forgot all that preceded it. A study of words is not calculated for a man without memory, and it was principally an endeavor to make my memory more retentive that urged me obstinately to persist in this study, which at length I was obliged to relinquish. As I understood enough to read an easy author by the aid of a dictionary, I followed that method, and found it succeed tolerably well. I likewise applied myself to translation, not by writing, but mentally, and by exercise and perseverance attained to read Latin authors easily, but have never been able to speak or write that language, which has frequently embarrassed me when I have found myself, I know not by what means, enrolled among men of letters. Another inconvenience that arose from this manner of learning is that I never understood prosody, much less the rules of versification. Yet, anxious to understand the harmony of the language, both in prose and verse, I have made many efforts to obtain it, but am convinced that without a master it is almost impossible. Having learned the composition of the hexameter, which is the easiest of all verses, I had the patience to measure out the greater part of Virgil into feet and quantity, and whenever I was dubious whether a syllable was long or short, immediately consulted my Virgil. It may easily be conceived that I ran into many errors in consequence of those licenses permitted by the rules of versification, and it is certain that if there is an advantage in studying alone, there are also great inconveniences and inconceivable labor, as I have experienced more than any one. At 12 I quitted my books, and if dinner was not ready, paid my friends the pigeons a visit, or worked in the garden till it was, and when I heard myself called, ran very willingly, and with a good appetite to partake of it. For it is very remarkable, that let me be ever so indisposed, my appetite never fails. We dined very agreeably, chatting till Madame de Warrens could eat. 2 or 3 times a week, when it was fine, we drank our coffee in a cool shady arbor behind the house, that I had decorated with hops, and which was very refreshing during the heat. We usually passed an hour in viewing our flowers and vegetables, or in conversation relative to our manner of life, which greatly increased the pleasure of it. I had another little family at the end of the garden. There were several hives of bees, which I never failed to visit once a day, and was frequently accompanied by Madame de Warrens. I was greatly interested in their labor, and amused myself seeing them return to the hives, their little thighs so loaded with the precious store that they could hardly walk. At first curiosity made me indiscreet, and they stung me several times, but afterwards we were so well acquainted that, let me approach as near as I would, they never molested me, though the hives were full and the bees ready to swarm. At these times I have been surrounded, having them on my hands and face, without apprehending any danger. All animals are distrustful of man, and with reason, but when once assured he does not mean to injure them, their confidence becomes so great that he must be worse than a barbarian who abuses it. After this I returned to my books, but my afternoon employment ought rather to bear the name of recreation and amusement than labor or study. I have never been able to bear application after dinner, and in general any kind of attention is painful to me during the heat of the day. I employed myself, 'tis true, but without restraint or rule, and read without studying. What I most attended to at these times was history and geography, and as these did not require intense application, made as much progress in them as my weak memory would permit. I had an inclination to study Father Pitot, and launched into the gloom of chronology, but was disgusted at the critical part, which I found had neither bottom nor banks. This made me prefer the more exact measurement of time by the course of the celestial bodies. I should even have contracted a fondness for astronomy, had I been in possession of instruments, but was obliged to content myself with some of the elements of that art, learned from books, and a few rude observations made with a telescope, sufficient only to give me a general idea of the situation of the heavenly bodies. for my short sight is insufficient to distinguish the stars without the help of a glass. I recollect an adventure on this subject, the remembrance of which has often diverted me. I had bought a celestial planisphere to study the constellations by, and having fixed it on a frame, when the nights were fine and the sky clear, I went into the garden, and fixing the frame on 4 sticks, something higher than myself, which I drove into the ground, turned the planisphere downwards, and contrived to light it by means of a candle, which I put in a pail to prevent the wind from blowing it out, and then placed in the centre of the above mentioned 4 supporters. This done, I examined the stars with my glass, and from time to time referring to my planisphere, endeavored to distinguish the various constellations. I think I have before observed that our garden was on a terrace, and lay open to the road. One night, some country people passing very late, saw me in a most grotesque habit, busily employed in these observations. The light, which struck directly on the planisphere, proceeding from a cause they could not divine, the candle being concealed by the sides of the pail, the 4 stakes supporting a large paper marked over with various uncouth figures, with the motion of the telescope which they saw turning backwards and forwards, gave the whole an air of conjuration that struck them with horror and amazement. My figure was by no means calculated to dispel their fears. A flapped hat put on over my nightcap, and a short cloak about my shoulder, which Madam de Warrens had obliged me to put on, presented in their idea the image of a real sorcerer. Being near midnight, they made no doubt but this was the beginning of some diabolical assembly, and having no curiosity to pry further into these mysteries, they fled with all possible speed, awakened their neighbors, and described this most dreadful vision. The story spread so fast that the next day the whole neighborhood was informed that a nocturnal assembly of witches was held in the garden that belonged to Monsieur Noiret, and I am ignorant what might have been the consequence of this rumor, if one of the countrymen who had been witness to my conjurations had not the same day carried his complaint to 2 Jesuits, who frequently came to visit us, and who, without knowing the foundation of the story, undeceived and satisfied them. These Jesuits told us the whole affair, and I acquainted them with the cause of it, which altogether furnished us with a hearty laugh. However, I resolved for the future to make my observations without light, and consult my planisphere in the house. Those who have read Venetian magic in the Letters from the Mountain may find that I long since had the reputation of being a conjurer. Such was the life I led at Les Charmettes when I had no rural employments, for they ever had the preference, and in those that did not exceed my strength I worked like a peasant. But my extreme weakness left me little except the will. Besides, as I have before observed, I wished to do 2 things at once, and therefore did neither well. I obstinately persisted in forcing my memory to retain a great deal by heart, and for that purpose I always carried some book with me, which, while at work, I studied with inconceivable labor. I was continually repeating something, and am really amazed that the fatigue of these vain and continual efforts did not render me entirely stupid. I must have learned and relearned the eclogues of Virgil 20 times over, though at this time I cannot recollect a single line of them. I have lost or spoiled a great number of books by a custom I had of carrying them with me into the dove house, the garden, orchard, or vineyard, when, being busy about something else, I laid my book at the foot of a tree, on the hedge, or in the first place that came to hand, and frequently left them there, finding them a fortnight after, perhaps, rotted to pieces, or eaten by the ants or snails. And this ardor for learning became so far a madness that it rendered me almost stupid, and I was perpetually muttering some passage or other to myself. End of section 14. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey.